Hello, and welcome to a special edition of the Blawgcast, where we'll be doing a video essay on modernism in A Song of Ice and Fire. Attempting to identify traces of particular literary movements in contemporary literature can be quite perplexing even for well-read students or scholars. One might easily detect, say, modernist elements of a text that turn out to be more markedly postmodern, or some murky middle ground. In contemplating a text for this project, I found many of my considerations alarmingly confounded in terms of literary influence. Now, my narrow scope should be noted, as I haven't studied all major movements, and my studies these past few months involve modernism exclusively. Even so, the text I chose appears as an amalgamation of influences, so we ought to take care in pinning down textual elements that are purely modernist, assuming that they exist. If any component of a contemporary text can fasten itself to modernism in an unmitigated fashion, this video essay will demonstrate that connection. Here I draw two relationships between modernist literature and the fantasy series that HBO adapted into Game of Thrones. I'll establish an initially broad connection that needn't rely on text, yet demands an understanding before zooming in on the text for a salient view of our second kinship. First, a brief overview of the text at hand. In his remarkably popular yet unfinished fantasy series, A Song of Ice and Fire, George R.R. Martin grips the reader with numerous tight third-person points of view that portray the human heart in conflict with itself. A few mediums here are love, death, dragons, betrayal, ice zombies, shame, redemption, dragons making love with ice zombies. Okay, that last part was a lie, but you get the gist. Like I said before, the series appears reflexive to all movements, with clear romantic traits as well as that grim, postmodern pessimism. But the most gripping aspects of the text for me are those that are rooted in modernism. And while this world that George R. R. Martin renders is layered with modernist influences on a few different levels, I found two specific motifs that overshadow the rest. The first one serves as an unavoidable backdrop that entangles the lives of these characters in disillusionment, that is, corruption and manipulation, masquerading as tradition and honor. Westeros runs on feudal monarchy, with your everyman at the bottom of the food chain powerless, while the selfish and powerful rule from the top. Lords go to war for kings, dragging their subjects helplessly along for the bloodshed. Large, impersonal systems of power that disillusion people are absolutely fundamental to modernist literature. James Joyce depicts the Catholic Church as such in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and all of Kafka's work centers around impossibly powerful bureaucratic structures. Even in its infancy, this type of construct proves integral to modernism. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness beats through the ribcage of colonialism. Another human establishment we lost control of, succumbed to, and tortured ourselves with. The second and clearest connection between modernism and A Song of Ice and Fire manifests itself on the page in harsh depictions of the brutality of war. This second motif rests on the first. A system that binds people to its will necessitates unfortunate circumstances. In both modernist literature and A Song of Ice and Fire, a large impersonal structure manufactures deeply personal and effective conflicts that can be observed closely in the text. World War I shocked the world by demonstrating technology's new capacity for killing humans on an enormous scale. Like a nationalist state that forces its men to fight in war, technology ought to be considered one of these unavoidable structures that escape an individual's control and harms them. Chemical warfare began in World War I, and it made its presence known. The after effects destabilized veterans with shell shock or PTSD. The audacity of this new type of war forced a creative response where individuals found themselves helpless on any physical or political level. The blood of the Romantics spilled in those trenches before writers and artists infused it into modernism. And no writers more plainly echo this brutality and chaos than the World War I poets. Wilfred Owen sets it down precisely in Doce et decorum est. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. The narrator of this poem recalls being assaulted by chlorine gas in World War I, and relays their frantic equipping of masks to the reader, yet one of his brothers in arms was not fast enough in his reaction. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. Chlorine gas provided a painful death in this poem, one not swift but sprawling through line and stanza and memory for the writer. In A Song of Ice and Fire, the story, though it contains some magical elements, takes place in a medieval world. Their warfare consisted of swords and shields and trebuchets, yet George R. R. Martin deploys a weapon analogous to that of chlorine gas in the Battle of Blackwater Bay, which occurs in the series' second installment, A Clash of Kings. For a solid conceptualization of this analogy, though, some context is in order. At this point in the series, the king has died, forcing a few claimants to the throne to wage war on the crown. The dead king's brother assaults the royal capital from the sea, leading a strong naval force into Blackwater Bay. The royal forces proved cunning in their preparations, however, assembling a cataclysmic supply of a thing called wildfire. Now, prior to the series, a family of dragon kings ruled the realm. They employed pyromancers for the production of wildfire, but it was never actually used in war. See, wildfire is equivalent to napalm or gasoline or even something more potent. Its capacity for destruction might even border on that of the atom bomb, at least from a medieval perspective. So, the idea of using it to kill humans harbors a sort of vile insanity, reminiscent of chemical or nuclear warfare in real life. Nonetheless, barrels of wildfire were tossed onto the naval force of the would-be usurper, and fiery arrows rained down from the castle and into the bay. Though in the form of prose, a few snippets of narration from Sir Davos portray a chaos and destruction similar to that of Wilfred Owen's description. A flash of green caught his eye. An instant later, Davos heard the dread cry of "Wildfire!" Men wreathed in green flame leapt into the water, shrieking like nothing human. Martin allows a brutal view through the eyes of Davos, who sees men all around him helplessly perish in an unthinkable act of war never before seen by the realm. Wilfred Owen's narrator witnesses a death that resonates deeply, and so does Davos. Though he is spared of a first-hand view of their deaths, several of his sons, spread amongst the ships, perish in pain and flame. He couldn't be sure, but the unlikelihood of their survival becomes apparent amid the explosions and destruction. My sons, Davos thought, but there was no way to look for them amidst the roaring chaos. Another hulk, heavy with wildfire, went up behind him. Wilfred Owen and George R. R. Martin both exhibit personal anguish in the midst of an overarching conflict fueled by two things. Firstly, the men of World War I went to fight for their country, a country which drafted its soldiers. Conversely, the men who burned on ships in Blackwater Bay fought for their king, by way of the liege lords who ruled them. Men in war lacked for choice. Secondly, World War I was fought with new weapons whose unthinkable destruction broke many a seasoned soldier, while King's Landing employed an analogous technology. Both were used for killing on a mass scale of a capacity that otherwise would not exist. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling. A wall of red-hot steel blazing wood and swirling green flames stretched before him. The mouth of the black water rush had turned into the mouth of hell. George R. R. Martin knew precisely the type of conflict he portrayed because he saw the modernists do it first, and they knew it too. The old lie at the end of Dulce et decorum est translates to how sweet and honorable it is to die for one's country. And in A Song of Ice and Fire, honor is also a huge theme. Dying on the field of battle for one's lord or king is honorable, but in both cases, irony washes up on the page through the brutal imagery and grim reality of war. Modernism pits the individual up against structures of power, and contemporary literature follows suit, in this case at least. In more specific light, the World War I poets depict humans in conflict with themselves, all astounded and surrounded by the audacity of the mass-killing machines that they themselves had created. Following the modernists, any depiction of war, fiction or no, would be lying if it didn't portray a similar, blood-soaked, disillusioned brutality. Thanks for listening, and, by the way, Stannis Baratheon is the one true king of Westeros.